you watched my video just a couple weeks back, I had a pattern haul, and this pattern was it. It is Vogue 8888, and we're going to work on Slip View E today. I had in my stash this very pretty gray lace. Isn't that pretty? So I ran to the store to get a silvery gray satin to go with it. That's one thing I like about this pattern is it's not one that you need to have a tricot knit. You could definitely do it in a tricot type knit, but it works great in a satin because it's cut on the bias, so it's very pretty. View E really is satin, lace, a little bit of elastic. Now it does show in the directions they put just a top lace, decorative lace trim stitched on top of the lace inserts. I do not have a lace for that, and I don't know if I'm going to do that. I was considering doing a little beadwork. I don't know if that'll show up in this video though. I'm just not going to do it because I don't have anything that I like with my lace options, and it's hard to find gray like this. You can find silver, like metallic, which I didn't love. And I couldn't even find where it showed the yardage amount for that trim. It must be in there somewhere, but I missed it in all the times that I read the directions. So before I start though, this does not have to have any of the scallop edge showing, but I want to show you on this lace. This is my selvage edge, and can you see the scallop? It's meant to be cut away, so I'm going to show you. It's really easy to do, and a lot of laces will come like this. You're just going to, there's little strings, and we're just going to cut it away. So we just cut through along the scalp. They're little eyelashes, and then your scallop will appear for your lace. That's all there is to it. If I want to put this on the hemline or on a sleeve or something, that's what, isn't that pretty? We're just going to start cutting out. This pattern goes up to a size 20, which I think should be good. I may add a little bit in the hip line. I always want a little extra in the hip. I just do. So we're going to get cutting, and I'll head up the sewing machine. Here's our back pattern piece. It's cut on the bias. You could cut two of them. There is a back seam, and if you look at the seam, it's shaped. It's not a straight up and down seam. This is our grain line. So when we're cutting this out, like if this were our fabric and our grain line is going to be like this, you can see the angle. So if you want to make alterations to this, you're not changing your grain line, but you are changing your seam line. For me, because I know I need fullness and I need it in the back, in the derriere, I am shaping this even a little bit more. I've added a little bit in the center back, and I'm cutting this on the widest size through the hip line, and then I'm narrowing it as I come up through the waist and up towards the bust line. The bust line is all cut out on an 18, and I'm going to start at an 18 here and slowly curve that back out to the 20 here. And I did the same thing on the front. Now the front's a little more confusing. When you look at the pattern piece, here's our front. So on the bias, it's going to look like this. And so what I've done is, right now it's all cut out at a 20. I've just cut everything on the 20. This is the 18 cutting line. So up here, right under the bust, I'm going to cut it at an 18, but I'm going to ease it out before the waistline back to a 20. I can always take it back in, and these are small amounts. You can see how that's going to add 1/4 of an inch here and an 1/8 of an inch there. Like it all adds up though for a better fit. So for me, that's what I'm doing. I'm not changing anything in the front, though I could easily have swung out this hip line a little more in the front too, but I don't need it in the front. I need it in the back. There are two pieces that are cut out of the contrast, which is my lace, and that's piece 23 and piece 21. 21 comes individually in each size, so you need to look there. When you look in your pattern, there's going to be a lot of pattern piece 21s. This one is the size 18, which is what I want because I'm doing the smaller bust line. So we're going to cut these two out of the lace. Everything else gets cut out of the satin. You could cut this one out of lace and satin if you wanted to. This is your bust cup, and that's just up to you. You could also cut it just out of lace if you wanted a totally lace bust line. That could be very pretty if you choose to. If you wanted to make this a gown, like something you could wear as a cocktail dress or something, you could also cut it out of both pieces, line it with the satin, and put your lace over the top. It would also be pretty if you went with sequins because, you know, innerwear is outerwear. I'm doing something I normally would tell you not to do, which is I'm cutting out of the middle of my fabric. These are my selvage edges, which is where we would get this pretty scalloped edge of our lace. And you can see I have a big piece of it. I want to preserve this scalloped edge. If I wanted to use it as a hemline or a sleeve or a neckline and keep that scallop, so I'm preserving that. So I'm going to cut right out of the middle of this so that I have that nice line saved for another project. If I want to make a robe or something, it's there. And so this is how it's going to look for me out of these pieces. Now you could buy trim lace as long as it's wide enough to fit this pattern piece. So you need like 8 to 9 inch wide lace. You could get pattern piece 23 in it, and you could even use trim lace for cutting these two out. So that's how the lace is going to look. So I'm beginning to lay out the slip, and I want you to see down here I have a lot of extra fabric hanging off. So when you have a bias cut, the grain line is still straight of grain, so you're measuring across, but you can see it makes the pattern piece skewed. So we need one front piece, it's completely open. We need 2 back pieces. So I have my first back piece laid out, but when I go to cut the second one, I'm going to have to flip it over facing the opposite direction. Otherwise, what will happen is I will end up with 2 left backs or 2 right backs. This is satin, it's directional. You've got a right and a wrong. So we have to make sure we flip our pattern pieces for anything like this and like this. We need 2 of these cut out of the satin. And again, make sure you cut one right side up and one wrong side up. Otherwise, you'll get two right side bust lines. And then we're doing the same for these. We need 2 of each of these. These are also on the bias. It has good directions. It shows how it should look to be cut out, and it is cut out open. I will let you know that when you're cutting with satin on the bias, you may get a little bit of a difference in how the pieces look next to each other, because there is sort of a nap with satin. So you might get a piece that looks a little darker or a little lighter from right to left. That's just normal, part of the interest of bias. If you're working with something really nappy like a crushed velvet or a velvet or anything like that, it will really show. Also, this would not be great for a fabric that has a directional design on it. So you would end up with all of your flowers going sideways or your giraffes going sideways if you cut something on the bias. So the very first thing we're going to do is find our little pattern piece 20, and we're going to mark the little circles for your size, and we're going to do a gathering line between those circles. There are also some notches, so make sure you transfer your notches. All of those things are going to be really important when we're matching everything up. I'm going to run a couple gathering lines really quickly to gather up that bust line, and then we don't have to gather yet, we just need the lines in, and then we're going to come back and add our first piece of lace. Here we are. We're going to take pattern piece 21. This is called bodice front. So you have this notch here, and it corresponds to this notch there. So they're going to sew to each other and line up beautifully like that. All right, so that's what we're going to do. It's flat, it's not folded, so we're just going to, and with lace has a right and a wrong, so make sure you get your lace lined up correctly. This continues the shape. So this is going to be sewn on the 5/8 inch. You could serge this. You could just serge this straight on down and trim off your seam allowance. I am going to put a few pins in it because it has you trimmed down to your 1/4 inch. Can you see how this hangs off? Can you see the difference? There's like a little V right here, and that's because they meet at the 5/8 inch perfectly right here. And then when this folds back, it will continue the shape perfectly. So don't worry if they don't line up on this outer edge. The cut edge does not need to match up. What needs to match up is this, where your seam allowance is, where you're sewing it together. That's where it needs to line up. So if you're worried about it, straight stitch it at the machine first, double check it, and then come and overlock it. If you are sewing this all on the sewing machine, after you've sewn this seam, trim it back to your 1/4 inch, and then you need to do a zigzag. You need to bias bind it. You need to find a way to finish it. You can even self-finish, do a Hong Kong finish, something like that. I have quite a few examples of that. If you want to go look at my playlist, I have a playlist, I think it's called Notebook Playlist, and it has a lot of the same finishes in there, so you can kind of look and see if there's one you'd like to try. Because this is a woven, it will fray. So let's sew this up really quickly, and I will show you what it looks like once we've trimmed off our seam allowance. Can you see how that looks? All right, we have 2 of those. Now we're going to grab pattern piece 22, short bias pieces. So we are going to go to the iron, and I'll take you over and do some close-ups. We're going to fold this in half. We're going to fold in our little ends. So we're making a bias, a double fold bias strip. It's all done with this iron. So we're going to go iron all this up. First of all, do a test, because almost all satins, unless you're working with the silk, will be a synthetic, and they can melt, they can leave lines. I don't know if you can see, but I pressed over my serging line here. This is just a sample piece, just to see how it affects it, and you can see how it shadows through. So you want to be really careful. You might even want to use a press cloth. We're supposed to now take what we've sewn. This is what it looks like. And you want to press that seam allowance back towards the satin, so away from the lace. You don't want to see your seam allowance hiding underneath. So we're going to push that to the back. You can press this from either side. Lace can also melt, so you want to watch your heat on this, and you can press it from either side, whatever works for you. I'm kind of being cautious because I do not want my lace to melt, so I'm going to do a quick little run over from this side and then switch sides. So that's how it will look. The seam, this shape just continues up. So once we've done that for both pieces, we're going to take our little piece number 22, and we're going to turn it into double fold bias tape. And so you're going to actually fold up 1/4 inch. You can do it 2 ways. I tend to fold it in half first because it makes it easier to find your 1/4 inches, in my opinion. And we're working so that it's right side out, wrong sides together for this. Be careful not to stretch too much. You can always stretch it while sewing it on if you need to. So you can see how pretty that presses. So we're gonna press it in half. And once you've pressed it in half all the way down, you can open it back up, and we're gonna fold in to that fold mark. We're gonna and press those, and that gives us our double fold. So you can kind of see how it's working. So you can see all those little fold lines there, and then those will all fold in together to make a beautiful little bias tape. So that's what we're doing for piece number 22. You're going to do it all the way down for both pieces. Okay, so piece number 25, you're going to do the exact same thing for it too. So if you're sitting here making bias, go ahead and make it all up at the same time. It'll actually save you time in the long run. So I'm going to go ahead and press all of my bias pieces, get them ready, and then I'll meet you back over the sewing machine to apply this. So here's how the bias looks. I just stuck pins in it periodically just to keep it together while it cools, because it is synthetic. It wants to spring back open. So that's just how I handled it. Here's all my little bias hanging here waiting to be used. Once we've done that, I'm going to unpin, and we're actually going to slide this lace edge into our bias and stitch it up. And you should have some that hangs off the top. Don't worry about it, just stitch it on up. We'll true all that up later. So we're going to top stitch on both sides our little short piece of bias to this lace. After that, it actually gets laid on top of each other, and we're going to tack it down here. So this is our directions. We've done this, we've done this, we've done this, and we're going to do this. And once that's done, it says whip stitch the front together. So right here, you can just see there's a little crossover. There's actually a little mark on the pattern that shows us where to cross it over to stitch it. Then we're going to come down and start this. I'm so excited. It's actually going pretty fast. The bias is the part that takes the longest. About to put this under the sewing machine, but look at how pretty that's going to look. I just think it's lovely. We're just going to line this up and stitch along the edge. You just want to make sure that you're catching both layers of your bias so that you don't end up with any little holes in it. And we're just going to top stitch all the way down. A little close up of how the stitching is coming out. Very pretty. Because we're top stitching this, if you'd like to come back and top stitch this side to keep that seam allowance from flipping over, you certainly could. It'll just tie all together. So I have it upside down. Here's the little point. So this is sort of the under bust. And here is pattern piece 23. And I've just pinned right sides together. So this is going to fold back like this and fill in this little waistline. So you just want to make sure you line it up. There's actual little notches. And we're going to sew this 5/8 of an inch. And then I'm going to come back and serge that off and press it under. You can zigzag it. It does say to trim back the seam allowance to 1/4 inch and double stitch it however you choose to do for a seam finish. I did top stitch on this, so I've got my lace, and then I went ahead and did top stitch that too. I think I'll do the same thing here when I'm done. I'll press it to the back and top stitch this, just to make everything the same. So we have our lace on the sides here, and now we've got our little bodice part. And I've pinned at the center front, lined it up, and I've pinned at the side seam. And we're just going to keep pinning until we get to the gathers, going both directions. And once we get that done, then we'll know what's to gather up. So we're going to pin our straight pieces in real quick. And there's notches. There's lots there to help us keep it straight. Be careful not to stretch your lace if you have a lace that is soft and might give a little. You are at the sewing machine, and when you're sewing your lace onto your satin, if you're having any issues with it, put the lace on the bottom and the satin on the top. That might help you. We're going to do this all the way across, but you can see here's where my gathers are, where my basting lines are. So now I can take those lines and pull them to ease in that fullness. We'll just even out our gathers nice and pretty. And we'll be ready to sew this in at the 5/8 inch. And then once we've sewn the 5/8, we'll come back and serge off and finish our seam allowance. I will. If you're not serging, you need to zigzag or bias bind or something to finish off your seam allowance so that you don't have any fraying. All right, so it's going to look something like that. You're going to come and do the other side. It'll be really easy to sew. Remember that right here where this point is, we're sewing at the 5/8 inch. So the part that matters is the pin at the 5/8. That's where it's going to matter the most. That's where we want it to meet. And then, look at how pretty that's going to be. If you're doing an additional trim, like it shows in step 8, now is the time to put it on. And they actually show the trim kind of coming around like this. If you want to do that, this is the step to do it on. You're going to press, so far we've been pressing the seam allowances towards the center front. This seam here is going to get pressed up towards the bust line, so it's not hanging down in this large piece of lace. So you don't see it. So we're just going to kind of give it a little press up along here. And now we're ready to add our bias along here, which I pressed earlier. Now we're going to take this, and we're now at step 10, because we did step 9 at the same time we did step 3. Something about satin, I don't know if you can see it, but satin does two things. It watermarks, so if you're pressing with steam, you might get watermarks. So you have to watch for that, and it will also leave little holes. You can see where you've pinned. You have to be really careful about that. Now this satin will heal, especially if I press it, it'll kind of close back up. Test it. I always take a piece of my fabric, especially satin. Acetate's the worst. This is a polyester, so it's better. Silk's the best. To find some silk charmeuse, something like that. It's the best, best, best. So we're going to take this. It's just going to go around this little armhole, and because it's bias, it will curve beautifully. And we're going to top stitch this on just like we did this neckline piece. And it's just going to go around and up. No, I have not trimmed this off yet. So we need to just take this shape here, and we're just going to trim that off. You can see the excess. I'm going to trim off that excess, trim the binding. So here's our shape, and I'm lining up right with that edge of the lace. I'm using the lace, and we're trimming it. There we go. So now this will just encase and go straight up, and we will just top stitch. It'll run right off the top because we're going to use it to go around to the back to make our little strap. Sandwiching in those raw edges, and then we'll just top stitch all the way across for both armholes. I'm sorry I keep moving the camera around. I'm just really trying to figure out the best place to film from. So you're kind of in the corner between my machines, but I think it's going to work. So here's our pretty little top of our slip. Here's the bias pinned on, and I'm ready to just start sewing. Our front is pretty well done. Isn't that pretty? I'm loving this gray. I just think that is very, you don't see it as often. I like it. I think it looks really elegant. So now that we've done that, we're moving to the back. So we're going to do our center back seam, and you can do a French seam if you want to. I'm going to just serge my center back seam together on the 5/8 inch line, right sides together, and then we're going to put in our elastic. And I do recommend using pins when working with satin, or clips or something, because it just slides against itself when you have right sides together, and you end up chasing your fabric around a lot. So I'm pinning at each end first, so top and bottom, and then I'll come back and pin in the middle. If you have something that's a long seam that you're pinning, if you start at one end and work towards the other, you will end up stretching either the top or the bottom, and they won't match when you get to the other end. And it's frustrating, and especially if you're working with bias. Bias has a lot of stretch in it, and this whole garment is bias cut. So we're going to be very careful not to stretch. And I'm going to come right here to my serger, and I'm going to serge this really quickly. Here's my pretty back before pressing, so you can see the seam. Look at how shiny that is. So we're going to press this, and once that's pressed, we're ready to do the elastic. Now the way they have a little guide in there. You measure your elastic for your size and cut it. So here's my little piece of elastic for my back. It has you on the wrong side, just sewing your elastic straight down the edge, 3/8 inch elastic. So you're going to just stretch it and sew it all the way down, like so. So you can see how I'm pulling and stretching. You're going to just top stitch it on, and then you're going to turn it over and stitch it again. You could definitely, they gave you 5/8 of an inch, so you could make a casing and put your elastic through it if you want to do it that way. If you're like I am and you're serging, you can serge your elastic on first and then flip it over and top stitch it down. So you can do it either way. I personally, if it were me at a sewing machine, I would zigzag this edge, fold over, and make a casing and fish it through. I think that's going to look the nicest. If you're at an overlock like I am, you can overlock it, turn it over, make a casing, and put your elastic through. Or you can pin on your elastic and serge it on, and then turn and stitch. So there we go. So here's my elastic. We'll serge it, turn it, and stitch it. So that's what I'm going to do real quick. Not a full 5/8 inch turnover. It looks like it's more like 3/8 of an inch according, if you look at the pattern. Yeah, the fold line's small. I think the pattern's on the floor. I'm looking at it. The fold line's not very big. So I'm going to just serge this. Getting ready to serge my elastic on, and I have put my fabric and my elastic down inside, and then I've sunk the needles into the elastic so that when I pull to stretch it, it can't pull out. Because if you don't catch that first bit of elastic with the needles, when you go to pull, you're going to pull it right out from underneath the needles. So I'm going to take a few stitches without pulling first to get it going so I can get a hold of it from behind, and then I'm going to give it a good yank. You can also cut your elastic longer than I did so you can actually hold on to an elastic tail, and that's just to give you leverage when you're pulling this through so you don't get too many gathers. You also don't need gathers in your seam allowance on the side seam, so you want that to be pretty straight there too. We're ready to go. Here's my elastic. I personally like to do a triple zigzag for this, so I'm going to change my foot real quick for what I call the triple zigzag. It's an elastic stitch. On my machine, it is stitch number 4. I'm going to just fold into this under now. To the right, so I'm sewing on the right side. That's the stitch that I'm doing. And you can see I don't have any stretch right here on the outer edge because that's where the seam is. And can you see how it's taking multiple stitches in each leg of the zigzag? I'm holding this back here. I'm not pulling, I'm just giving it leverage as it gets started. Now I'm going to start stretching. And I'm holding onto this because when you're pulling against this, you can pull it right out from underneath your foot. So I'm just using my other hand as an even feed. And the tails of your thread really help for this. And that's how it looks. I think it's very attractive. Here we are. There's my back. Now we're ready to put front to back. We're going to sew our front to our back, and we actually have notches to line up. Now you can do a French seam if you want to on this, or like I'm doing, I'm just serging it. So we're going to just pin this and serge it down. When you're sewing up this little edge here, this is where the lace came in and kind of came off the edge. So if we press that down, we're just going to sew across it like this. It can kind of look wonky and look a little confusing and you're not sure where to go. And you may have a little extra tail of lace hanging off. I would just even it out and not worry about it. As long as you get it even on both sides, it'll look fine. We're down to the final little fiddly bits. We've got our side seam done, and now you can see this is where it came together at the side, and that just looks not great. I don't like to see that. So I'm going to tuck this back under behind here, and I'm going to stitch over it and stitch that down to hold it. I'm pressing towards the back, so I'm going to do that on both sides. This is where the arm binding comes into the back where the elastic is. So that's what I'm going to just push it back and stitch that down. I'm actually going to try and just stitch in the old stitching line right there and cover it up and make it look pretty on both sides real quick. Time to put our straps on in the back. So here's the back of my garment right here, and we're going to just take our straps around. Now you really should try this on to get the strap lengths exactly what you want, and then we're just going to stitch it down. If you did like I did, where you did triple zigzag, I'm going to sort of stitch it on top of that zigzag, though you could just tack it down. And then I did go ahead and just, it's not very pretty, but I did seam finish that. I did a little zigzagging along my ends to just keep it from fraying too much. I haven't given it much of a haircut yet. You can see it's pretty furry, but we're going to just tack those down, and then it's time for him. Okay, we have, I'm going to show you from the inside out. This is the wrong side, but we have a slip together, so this is on the inside. I've pressed most of it, and all that's left is the hem. Now, if you have trim that you put around your neckline, if you bought enough, you could serge the edge of this and just put lace. You could totally have a lace hem, which would be beautiful. I wish I had lace to do that with, but I don't. You could serge it, turn it up. You could roll hem that hem. Like, you have options. What they have us doing is what's called, it's a tiny rolled hem, but I made a garment just a few weeks back that had a baby hem on the sleeve. I'll put a link to it right here, and this is the same thing. It's a baby hem. You're going to press up all the way around to 1/2 inch, and you're going to stitch right along that 1/2 inch, right next to the fold, and then you trim off all the excess fold it over one more time and stitch again. So you've got this teeny tiny narrow rolled hem. It works beautifully. The only places you're gonna have any issues with it are wherever your seams are. If you have a French seam or a mock French seam, anything like that, you have a lot of layers of fabric right there, and it's not going to want to tuck in and be tiny in those spots. If you serged it, it'll be a little easier because it's more compressed. But I'm going to go ahead and do that. I want to warn you, when doing a hem like this on something that's so biased as the hem of this, when you do that kind of rolled hem, is it will want to stretch and you can get a lot of waves. Now that can be really pretty, especially if that's what you want, but you really don't want to get it so wavy that it twists and turns and doesn't hang right. So just be really cautious when you're doing this hem that you don't stretch it too much and distort your hem. The other thing with bias is that it grows. So if you, once you've made this garment, don't hang it. You want to keep it folded. Anything that's bias cut, if it hangs, it stretches, and it'll only stretch in one direction. So your hem will constantly grow. It'll grow wonky, it'll grow out of shape, and you'll have to re-hem it, and eventually it'll become so misshapen, it's kind of ruins your garment. So just only time it's hanging is when it's hanging from your shoulders or from your waist if it's a skirt. The rest of the time, keep it folded for the integrity of the garment if it's bias cut. All right, let's hem, and then I'll show you what it looks like finished. So I've pressed up my 1/2 inch, and you can see how I've got my 1/4 inch foot on. This inside this toe right here is 1/8 inch, so if I line up that fold right there, I've got a narrow little hem, and I'm just going to stitch it carefully and try my best not to stretch or pull. And you can see how small that is. And once I'm done, I'm going to trim all this off really close so that I can fold again and stitch one more time. Let me just show you, because this is what's happened to me. It's just starting to stretch and pull, and you can see this little wave that's happening. So, and it's, you can also see my seam allowance is suddenly getting narrower, and that's just the nature of the fabric and it wanting to pull. So I stopped immediately. I'm going to rip out a few stitches, readjust this, and start again instead of letting it continue, because what will happen is it'll actually just end up coming right off the edge and really mess up that hemline. Made my way around, so you can see this is how the hem looks, and you can see it's got a tiny bit of wave, but not much. It's really pretty flat for the most part. Now I'm going to take my scissors and we're going to trim off right up close to, but not through that stitching line. So we're going to trim off a lot of this thread, a lot of this excess fabric. All right, so you can see how narrow that is. I'm trimming it off. Now that once that's all trimmed, we're going to take this, we're going to press it one more time over, again, very narrow, and stitch it again. And then our garment's done. Okay, here we are, trimmed out and pressed over and ready to be stitched one more time around the circle. Here is the finished garment. I think it just hangs so pretty. That's very lovely. I didn't have the trim to do the extra trim that it shows on the picture and on the directions. I did find where to find how much trim to buy. It's on the inside pattern sheet, so it was a little hidden, but it was in there. The same for the elastic. It's on the inside of the pattern sheet. So here's how it looks in the back. Now this again is larger than my dress form, so this fits me, does not fit my dress form. But you can see how pretty it hangs. It really is a very elegant and lovely slip pattern. Definitely will be wearing this one. I think it turned out really pretty. I know I warned you about how satin can water spot, and it happened to me. I was pressing away and my iron spit and I have water staining right here. This is polyester, it's machine wash and dry. So is the lace, so I am going to just run it through the washing machine and give it another press, and it should hopefully all come out. See you next week for another fun video.